Our first panelist is, plenarist is Ernest Edmonds, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, who is a distinguished, pioneering new media artist working in the field of computer art and human-computer interaction. He holds many awards, including the ACM SIGGRAPH Distinguished Artist Award for a lifetime achievement in digital art. He is also a professor of computational art at the Montfort University in Leicester in the UK, and he is chairman of the board of ISCMA. Today he will be speaking about the concept of art and influence learning in augmented worlds, and he will be speaking about the nature of interaction in augmented worlds, and he will introduce terms that are perhaps more suitable to describe what he's doing than interaction, such as, for example, influence, stimulus, and interchange. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Edmonds.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's an exciting conference. I'm extremely pleased to be here just listening. But anyway, for the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be talking. As you've heard, I'm going to talk about art and influence, learning in augmented worlds, and I'll explain what I mean by those things as I go along. I'll start just with a couple of slides to tell you where I'm coming from. For example, this is a paper that my colleague Stroud Cornock and I presented in a computer graphics conference in 1970, and it got published in Leonardo in 1973, where we talked about the importance of interaction and in terms of the exploitation of the computer and computation in art. And we also referred indirectly, but very strongly, to the influence of artificial intelligence and what role it might have in the future of such art. And we drew pictures of different ways of interacting and different modes of interaction that we at that time saw as important. I'm not going to go through those because actually I'm going to talk about one that we didn't mention in 1970 in a few moments' time. And we actually built this young man helped build an interactive system in 1970 to illustrate this paper using something called a teletype and a graph plotter, things that we don't see in the exhibition here for some strange reason today. And here are some of the remnants from that interactive work that we built. It was called DataPack, and it was shown in that computer graphics exhibition. Anyway. And I had another line of development in those early days, which was concerned with communication. So around about the same time, 1970 and so on, I was looking at the communication between human beings through machines, making the artwork. So the artwork itself was passive. It consisted of a set of stations separated out where participants could interact through throwing switches and could see lights and so on. And they were in effect interacting with one another through the system. This was 1970, so I had to build this with a soldering iron rather than with software. And you'll see later on I came to do other kinds of things. Because of this interest in interaction between humans and machines, and interaction between humans through machines, as the modes of art that interested me at that time and still do, I became interested in the central problem. And what was the central problem? Well, the central problem wasn't actually artificial intelligence or software design or operating systems or whatever. It was the human. It was the human-computer interaction, which was the hard part. And you heard something about that yesterday in this conference. And so I became interested in what in those days we used to call man-machine interaction. The man and the machine words have both been changed, but that's the words of those days. And so I, in parallel, started working on human-computer interaction in the early 1970s. So that was my starting point. Jump forward a great many years. And what I'm actually going to talk about in the first part of my talk, I've termed art and influence. And this is my take on interaction as it should be. And this is where it's a little bit different to the Cornock and Edmonds 1970 take on it. And the reason that it's different is that the interesting psychological models of interaction are not to do with action response, as in ISCMA and so on, direct action and a direct response. But the interesting psychological models of interaction are systems theoretic ones. And I believe now that these should be the interesting models that we explore in art. Well, what's the key difference? Well, the key difference is that when we receive data in the real world, in a human world, in an animal world, that might have an influence on our immediate behavior, but it might have an influence on things in our brain that cause changes in our future behavior. Okay? So the systems view is one which takes the long term into account, if you like, and where interaction has influence on memory, for example, and intention and things of this kind, and not just on action. And I often describe this difference in the following way. I enjoy playing with my grandchildren, and I enjoy that I get an immediate response. But I also hope that I'm playing in a constructive way so that in 10 years' time they're different because of that play. And this is a normal thing to do. And of course, as a teacher, that's exactly what you do. It's not how the students react at the moment that is critical, it's what it means, what that teaching means for their future lives. And so these seem to be pretty critical human issues, and I believe worthy of deep attention in art. So I'm concerned with interactions that have effects in the future and may not even be observable at the time of the action. The interactive experience, then, is a never-ending process of development. So this is the central theme of this part of my talk, and I've been making art that deals with this issue. For example, this is a 2007 exhibition with a few of my pieces that I call Shaping Form, where basically these are screens made to look square, with generative art on those screens, so that there's colours, in this case they're colour stripes, and the colours and the stripe patterns and so on are changing generatively over time through a generative process. But in addition, built into this frame, there's a camera, and there is real-time analysis of movement going on in the space in front of that work on a computer that's sitting behind the screen. And that real-time analysis is being used not just to change what the screen looks like at that time, but also to change the parameters that drive the generative process. And for example, only a few days ago, I had dinner with a friend of mine who's got one of these works from 2007 or thereabouts, and it's been hanging on his wall for a long time. And we were both saying how surprising it was of how it was. It was very different to how it was last year or the year before. The saturation of the colours was new. Some of the patterns of behaviour were unrecognisable. They were quite different. And this is because it has been evolving over time as a result of the movements that have been taking place in front of it. Okay. Here are some of these pieces shown a couple of years ago in Rio de Janeiro. The one on the left is one of these 2007 ones. The other two are more recent ones using square monitors. I couldn't buy square monitors in 2007, but now I can. And I've also, as well as making pieces like this that sit on walls, I also make pieces that sit in environments. So I have an evolving piece called Shaping Space, and this consists of two plastic 2-meter square screens that are suspended in a dark room with rear projection behind them and cameras doing analysis and so on. So basically that's the same principle that I've just described, and the colours and the shapes and the patterns of movement and so on, changing all the time generatively, but also changing in different ways over time as a result of the experiences, you might say, that the work has had with the participants, with the audience moving in front of it. So shaping space, so here's a little movie, I'll just talk over this, there's no sound. So it's really a kind of representation of computational life, and these pieces learn. They have learning algorithms, and I should put learning quotes really, because we use the word learn and we use the phrase machine learning in very different ways. Because I'm old enough to remember when it meant something completely different to the way that it's often used today. Once upon a time, neural nets had got nothing to do with machine learning. That's just one way of doing machine learning. And in my pieces, I don't use neural nets. And in fact, I don't use anything that I can't understand. So the learning algorithms that are in my work are explicit and clear, right? And that's because as an artist, I want to control the medium that I'm using. This is a personal view, but I don't like handling things that I don't understand, okay? I don't use tempera because I don't know really quite how to use tempera. I'm happy with oil paint and I'm happy with acrylic and with pencils and so on and so forth. And so I use them when I make still work. And it's the same here. So the software here is deterministic. The algorithms are deterministic. But because these works interact with the world around them, these artworks are open systems, right? Open systems are systems that interact with other systems, with the environment around them. Therefore, we cannot predict what they will do, where they will go, what will become of them, because we can't predict what those interchanges with the external world will be. Okay. So I don't need any kind of random numbers or anything to make them do unexpected things. They do unexpected things because they're open systems in a world which I don't control. So these shaping space pieces and these shaping form pieces are ones that interact with the world, but I've come to use this other word, influence. The work is influenced by the participants. And in my experience, the participants are influenced by the work. Okay, but that's quite a normal thing in art, isn't it? We're all influenced by the art that we see around us. So I prefer to use the word influence rather than the word interact, because the interact seems to imply like direct action and response. Now the direct action and response is important, and it was quite interesting seeing Simon's work that he showed this morning with two components. And one component, you might say, exhibited interaction, and the other component exhibited influence. Right. So this is moving in the same direction that I'm talking about here. Out of these works, this isn't part of my talk really, but out of these works come other things. Static works fall off the side of these dynamic works. This is a 4-part painting, for example. And so there's a dialogue between the static and the dynamic and the interactive and the influence works. There's a dialogue between reflected light and transmitted light. So for example, if I take a screen grab from one of those works that I was showing you a few moments ago and print that onto paper or a canvas or something, then I'm moving from transmitted light to reflected light. And so if I say that, you won't be surprised to learn that I then have to manipulate those colours on that canvas or on that paper, because they're not what I had in mind, because the mapping between reflected and transmitted lights and vice versa is not simple. And in fact, there are colours that can only exist in one or other of those colour spaces. Now, I also mentioned, apart from interaction, this early influence that I had of thoughts about communication and communicative systems? Well, of course, much later in my life, when I didn't have to use soldering irons to make network art, I could use the internet. It became much easier. So I've been doing that too. So I have a series of works, like this is an example of one that I call Cities Tango. And these are works where things like the works that I've just been showing you run, but they run in several places at once. And I've got an example here with two images, one from part of this work on the left in Sydney, Australia, and the other part of the work in Belfast. And what I've done here is each one of those is being influenced by the audience in its place, but they're also influencing one another in real time. So the behaviour of the work in one location is influenced not only by the people in that location, but also by the work in the other location or locations. It doesn't have to be just two. And in these works, I've also, in order to deal with these different locations, I've used, in an abstract kind of way, images from the locations. So I take an image of Sydney, for example, and use it as a slice, as if it was a colour in Belfast, and vice versa. And then also interleave with these some real-time images that are captured. So sometimes you see what's been going on in the other place at the same moment of time, and so on and so forth. So here we have this notion of influence brought together with this notion of communication and connectivity across the world. And quite a natural step from that has been to work in public spaces. So this is in Melbourne, in Australia, on a big screen there, where you have these works now existing not in a gallery context, but in the street, if you like, about which I'll say a bit more in a few moments' time. This isn't because it's a picture of my artwork, but Venice is another place where I recently showed such a piece in this exhibition here. And, oops, I'm sorry, there's meant to be sound off. How do I do that? Oops, oh well, never mind. We'll soon go on from that. And so these things can exist in not just in clean white spaces that are like the traditional art gallery space, but also in public spaces, and like that space in Venice, which is not at all like the kind of minimalist artwork that it has, but can reflect that space and integrate with that space because of the match of the colours and so on, and the movement and integration with the other activities in that space. Here's another work in the Cities Tango series, and this one was between Rio de Janeiro and Leicester in the UK, where there's an overlaying of generative colour with images from the other location, right? And here's a little video about one of these works that I did with someone else, Sean Clark, called Tango Together, Tango Apart. Tango Apart, Moving Together was the correct name of the work. So what we see here is something that is using the notion of challenge, which is crucial to my work. I'd like to challenge perception visually about colour, and I like to challenge perception about location and connection. And so with these works, there's nothing obvious or clear about what's going on, but there are hints. And hopefully these works become intriguing in some sense or another, because those hints are hints that help us get a feeling of connectivity and of the spaces within which the other people live. Now, the other point is that this influence notion also applies here, because as well as this interaction across the internet, across cities, across continents, Also going on in the background is this learning algorithm in which the behavior of the piece changes over time. This is very important in public spaces. So I have other projects which are like street projects, where in different places in the street one has using displays that are either placed there specially or exist already in those spaces to connect together, for example, the back lanes of a city with the main shopping mall, to change the nature of how you relate these different parts of the city together. Now, when we do this, it's very important in terms of public engagement that we don't always see the same thing every day, right? That it does evolve and change and learn and move forward. And it's this change, which may be quite subtle and quite slow, but you think, well, actually last week that was rather, oh, I'm sorry about that, what have I done? Okay. Sorry about that, I must have touched. Oops. Now I'm back. I was waving my arms about in normal display of excitement and touched something on the computer that I shouldn't have touched. So that the engagement between the audience, who are now people in the street not trying to look at art but just coming across it in the street, the engagement with the audience is partly triggered by the fact that it is an evolving learning piece that is changing over time and looks different this week to last week, behaves differently this week to last week. So here is a piece that is on the books in a place called Parramatta in New South Wales as part of their development process. So this hasn't been implemented in the streets yet, but it's the notion of having screens and displays around the city that connect the city together in different ways, using the principles that I was briefly discussing in the earlier part of this talk. And I want to move on to the next part of my talk to deal with the learning in augmented worlds aspect to this. It's not surprising that you think, well, you could move from these real world situations to have virtual worlds. And I was, interestingly to me, I was working in the mid-80s in virtual reality, and we did stuff, and I think I was saying, I think it was to Simon earlier, that we used to have glasses with which you could look at these virtual objects in our virtual reality systems, but the only trouble was you had to have pieces of wire going from them to two big large silicon graphics computers that ran them. Now those big silicon graphic computers are actually in the glasses, so this has changed the world. So when I was doing this stuff in the mid-80s, I really didn't pursue it very far in terms of artworks because of the cumbersome nature of the interaction that could take place. And instead, I left it aside. But now, not quite, but pretty much we're there where we can start experimenting very really with this kind of things, where we can start to use augmented reality glasses as part of an artwork. And so this is very new, and there isn't any work here that I would like to show you as a proper artwork, but I'll show you the kind of thing we're doing. And this is the same kind of thing that I've been showing you, except now, instead of using like screens hung on walls or big projection screens in installations, instead the artwork is superimposed on the world around it as virtual objects. Right? Rather like those Cities Tango's pieces, you see bits of the real world and you see bits of chunks of colour, for example. So, you know, this is just like one of these things on test in a hotel room that someone was using with some of my colours being generated. This person was wearing the HoloLens, in fact, the Microsoft HoloLens. And we are now working on a system. So here's a mock-up. You saw some mock-ups in other parts of this conference. So here's a mock-up of wearing the HoloLens and seeing one of my artworks. In this case, the person seeing it isn't moving around, they're just looking at, in fact, a scene in Derbyshire in the UK, but they're actually linked across the internet to someone else wearing a HoloLens who's actually in Sydney in Australia, and occasionally you get a view of that other place coming up in this thing. So these notions of connected, influential, being influenced by artworks, using virtual reality is the next step that I'm looking at. But I want to stress these points that I made at the beginning, which is I believe that the old notion of action-response interaction in art is pretty boring today. We've done enough of that. It does have a place to play, but I think it has a place in a broader context. In the broader context, taking the systems theoretic view of interaction, where I'm using this word influence, where one is influencing the other, both ways around, to replace this simplistic notion of interaction. And how do we make these artworks? And my real question to us in this context of this meeting is, how do we move forward as artists using the concepts of these technologies and the psychology that is relevant to us? And how do we move forward in ways that really engage with the technologies, engage with the context, and make real serious art? What do we need as our tools? Well, we initiated, in my colleagues and I, a series of conferences called Creativity and Cognition back in '93, and I think in that context there have been a few examples, and I'll just show you one image which shows the point that I want to make, which is that I think human-computer interaction and art and AI need to work together in this world, and we need to understand what is already known in those three worlds to bring together to make the next. And this is an image from Creativity and Cognition in 2002, which kind of illustrates it in a nice way. So just to go through these people, on the left is Ben Schneiderman, HTI expert, founder of direct manipulation user interfaces and whatnot. Next is Stellark, well. Next is Gerhard Fischer, an important figure in human-computer interaction with also a foot in AI. And on the right-hand side, Marvin Minsky, one of the founders of artificial intelligence. But what is the picture showing? Well, actually, Ben Schneiderman is wearing Stellark's third arm and using it to shake hands with Marvin Minsky. That's where we need to go, and that's the way to combine these fields to move forward. And I'm trying to help that a little bit, so just a few concluding remarks. So one of the things we need to do is to look at how one field can influence the other. So I just recently published this book, which is about research in interactive art and how it helps develop the agenda for human-computer interaction. Okay? There are many different directions in which influences can come. This book deals with one of those directions, and I've written this particular book because it's a direction that seems to be forgotten a lot. So, a lot of art people get influenced by HCI, and the HCI people like that, but they don't realise that they need to be influenced by the art just as much, and that the artists are discovering things about interaction and know things about interaction that can inform human-computer interaction. Another area is AI. AI very much needs to be influenced by human-computer interaction, and it's found to do that. Many years ago, I was talking with Ed Feigenbaum, and after he'd just given a talk about AI and how AI wasn't being taken as seriously as it should be, that was before the current trends. And I said to him, but don't you think that AI needs to learn a lot from HCI in order to move forward and be more influential? And he said, no, we've got nothing to learn from them. He was wrong, okay? He was very wrong. And all of these people need to learn from one another. We need to learn from one another. I'd like to just finish by showing you, so all good students today are reading good books. And here's an example of a student reading a good book, and this is the book. I might be slightly prejudiced, but I find it quite a good book. And I'm going to conclude here, and if you want to contact me or know more about me, that's my website. Thank you.
Our second speaker today is Dr. Philippe Pasquier, forgive my poor pronunciation, who's an associate professor in the School of Interactive Arts and Technology and adjunct professor in cognitive science at Simon Fraser University in Canada. He's a scientist who specializes in artificial intelligence and machine learning, but he's also an artist specializing, among other things, in sound and generative art. He's also an educator who's interested in bringing these technologies to the larger community. Today, he will be speaking to us about advances in creative AI and computer-assisted creativity, where he will be introducing some of his work using machine learning and generative systems. Please welcome Dr. Pasquier.
Thank you. The pronunciation of the name was perfect, unlike mine, and so I want to make sure with this mic that you all get to enjoy my French accent for the next 30 minutes or so. I want to start by thanking Dr. Allen and all his team for what has been already, at least for me, a very fruitful time and a very fruitful gathering. I'm going to talk today about the work that we do regarding creative AI and computer-assisted creativity in the lab that I direct, the Meta Creation Lab. And I'll start somewhat unsurprisingly by some definitions, although I'm sure most of you are familiar, but I'll make a couple of claims while I do those definitions. The first is this notion of artificial intelligence, which is simply the idea of having computers doing things that it takes a brain and a cognition to usually do. And while with the Industrial Revolution we automated physical work, with the computer revolution, we automate, in a way, cognitive work. And it's hard to really know where AI starts and ends, because if you think about it, a 5-digit multiplication before computers, only a human brain and some eventually analog machine could help doing that. I am personally, want to make a claim, Descartes left us already, I think, but I am personally not enthusiastic about the idea of strong AI. I don't believe that we're going to get sentient, intelligent machine around anytime soon. We have no idea how human intelligence works, so let's not panic too much about computers taking over the world that way. That being said, weak AI, task-specific AI, is already there, and that's already a lot to deal with. There's so many rational problems that we've been solving. What's interesting with rational problem solving is that they all have an optimal solution of some sort of optimality defined in them. We fly plane, we drive car, we find the shortest path from A to B in a Google map, and we win or we lose at chess with those machines. In my lab, we're looking at a newer question in a way, looking at whether we can or not automate partially or completely not rational problem solving and those type of tasks, but creative tasks. And that's the idea behind the field of computational creativity, which precisely depart from traditional AI in the fact that the notion of optimality is ill-defined in the context of creative tasks. And so while creativity is really hard to define, philosophers would say it's an essentially contested concept, and they've been arguing about it forever, and they probably will do so for a long time more. I go around that problem by looking at the automation of creative tasks, not necessarily making machine creative, but automating creative tasks such as composing music, interpreting music, choreography, making jokes, designing or creating narratives, paintings, drawings, etc., etc. So that's really what we do in my lab. We study creative processes, trying to formalize them, and whether you call it meta creation, computational creativity, artificial creativity, generative art, procedural content generation, or creative AI, the idea is simply the aim is simply to partially or completely try to automate creative tasks. And while we do so, I'm a computer scientist myself by training, and I did quite a bit of music while I was conducting my degree in computer science. While we do so, we go across the spectrum from generative art, which is definitely an artistic practice with a charge with aesthetic choices and decision, any sort of art in which the artist decides to delegate a little bit of his or her autonomy to a system, across to computational creativity, which is really a scientific discipline that focuses on modeling and studying computational processes to achieve creative tasks. Eventually, to do so and looking at creativity as it is and modeling human creativity, or looking at creative processes that we know we can handle computers and machines with, but that human brains are not capable of. I'll start with an example of a composition made by Arne Engelfeld, a colleague of mine that is at Simon Fraser University. So what's original with this composition, it's obviously, there's no machine really involved in the interpretation of the composition, but the composition itself was generated by a machine, at least partially, and that's an example of computer-assisted composition. In that particular case, Arne Engelfeld used a system that we developed in the lab, developed in MaxMSP. It's available online, it's open source and free. And it's an harmonic progression generator that is doing style imitation for harmonic progression. You load existing compositions by existing composers, whether the composition of Arne Engelfeld or others, and you make a request to the system, and you decide for yourself if you're happy with what the system gives you or not. Eventually you iterate, you change some parameters of the corpus, load some other compositions, try something else, or change parameters of the request, and iterate and get to compositions that maybe you would not have done yourself, you could not have done yourself, or we would have took you a lot of time to do yourself. And that way, by interacting with that system, you get to explore a lot more direction than, let's say, you would have done if you would have manually made those compositions. So that's an example of computer-assisted composition. And in the first part of this talk, I'll focus on this type of system because we did a number of them in the lab. Typically, usually creative software, Photoshop, all the Adobe suite, as well as music making software, are purely inert. That is, you open them, and if you don't click somewhere, nothing will happen. And in fact, you have to have a precise idea of what you want to do, and you're going to have to click on buttons one by one until you get there. And for people that are professional in those areas, it means spending 8 hours a day clicking on buttons every day. So that's not completely satisfying. On the other hand, you have purely generative systems that you program the system, eventually the system learns from the corpus or not, and then you click generate, and then the system will generate a full composition. But in fact, and concretely, a lot of the application of generative systems and creative AI will be interactive systems. So I'll focus on these types of system for now. Because in a way, getting to a higher level of interaction with creative software is starting to become something that is much needed, because the computerization of society was pretty radical, pretty brutal, pretty systematic, and we end up with a lot of people. The modern Google-like office looks a little bit more fancy than that, but a lot of people just clicking on buttons all day long. So the canonical tasks that with those type of system and the one we developed in my lab are typically revolving around, exactly like this harmonic progression generator, is called style imitation. And the idea is, if you give me a corpus that is representative of a given style, one or several pieces, can be a small number of pieces or a large number of pieces, then the system has the task to generate new instances that would be classified as belonging to that style by an unbiased observer, that is you or I. Once you have systems that are working at human competitive level, and we do for this type of tasks, then you can start doing not only style imitation, but style interpolation. style combination, style transformation, and eventually style extrapolation. So we did exactly that through the years in the last decade for melodies, as well as for more complex type of structures, because in music you get, and that's quite hard to capture, you get a hierarchical structure. Sequences of notes from phrases, sequences of phrases will form parts, sequences of parts will form a particular piece. Here is another example of a computer-assisted composition done by a PhD student called Jeff Maxwell. He's now a doctor. And there's a transition between two parts that was generated with the help of the system. I'm going to start that a little bit here. Oh, my computer is not playing anymore. Oh well, we'll move on then. So we did that, and when we did computer-assisted composition, we tried also to do computer-assisted or computer generation of the interpretation of the compositions. And it turns out that composition is a lot easier than interpretation. And that's interesting, something interesting to note, because it is a reminder that it takes 15 years to master playing the violin, and that for those of, we can talk about his work earlier on, for those who do robotics, they know that getting a robot to pour a beer is like a $5 million project for 50 people for 5 years, while actually generating composition in the style of bar is now done routinely at human competitive level. So we tried to look at interpretation, but because it's so hard, we got back to electronic dance music, which we also like, and which does not necessarily require the human body in terms of making the interpretation. So we developed with a German company called Ableton, for a German company called Ableton, a plugin that allows to do style imitation within Ableton. It generates 11 tracks based on the corpus you load in. And here again, you interact with the system, choosing the complexity of the pattern, the density, the length. You generate a first set of patterns, listen to it. You're like, I don't like it. I'm doing it again. Generate another one. I don't like it. I'm going to change some parameters. I still don't like it. Or this time, maybe I don't like just the bass. Let's change the bass. No, not this bass, not this one. Yeah, maybe this one. I'll work with that. And then I can start editing and starting the work. And in a few minutes, you get quite a lot of work done. Here are examples of output of this particular system. And of course, different corpus, different settings, and different arrangements, and you get things that are different. That was breakbeat. Here is an example of house. With this type of systems, we press vinyls, and DJs are playing them in clubs. We've also been working at computer-assisted sound design to really try to go directly do composition and audio rendering without having a human intervention whatsoever. There's a system called Audio Metaphor made with now assistant professor at UBC, Mike Thorogood, during his PhD. And I'm going to talk over him. And in that particular system, you just enter a sentence in natural language. Let's say the kids are playing in the park, and there's a fountain. You decide how long your soundtrack is going to be, the sound design is going to be, and then you draw a curve for the valence and arousal. So you control not only you're going to generate something that responds to the request, but you're going to determine how it's going to be perceived. Maybe it starts, it's sad, and then it finishes to be really happy. Maybe it starts being calm and finish to be very eventful. And eventually, the system is going to go into a database, select sounds break them into pieces, and put them together into a mix, which you can directly download in Pro Tools, or render for yourself to listen to and generate another one if you don't like this one. And if you show that to a sound designer, finding all those sounds on a hard drive, or even using a simple database with keywords, cutting them together and putting these 35 sounds together, that's half a day of work right there. So if you do requests to this system, such as a waterfall in Thailand, it might sound like that. A city in the bush might sound like this. And then you can be a little bit more creative with the system if you wish, and make requests that eventually you don't really know how it should sound. We have also been working on computer-assisted sound synthesis. So this is still in the family of human interacting with machines in order to help them in their creative, in achieving those creative tasks. Modern synthesizers have a search space that is really, really vast. There's so many possible settings that you can search through that it's inhuman to search manually, really. So we did these systems where you give me a WAV file and I give you a preset for that particular synthesizer. We worked with a company based in Stockholm, friends of ours, that are designing great synthesizers. This is the OP1. It has 10 to the power 80 possible presets. There's 10 to the power 82 atoms in the universe. It's a big space. They themselves didn't know if they could generate a grand piano. I lost the sound again. Interestingly. I don't know what you did to get the sound back, but it worked. And this is, okay, let's try again. This is the sample of a grand piano, and this is what the OP1 would generate with a preset found by our system. And it's very, very, very close. And we made actually empirical experiment. There's no way a human get that close manually. And if he does so much slower than the system, although these systems take a few hours on a supercomputer to get a result. And then we went a little bit further, but you give me a set of sounds, and I give you a pure data synthesizer to make those sounds. This, on the other hand, for example, doesn't work yet, so I don't have any good example. It works only for very simple cases. Otherwise, we would have solved the sound synthesis problem, which would be great. So that's the first family of systems. Systems that creatives will interact with to partially or completely achieve their creative tasks. The other type of system we've been looking at are real-time, online, embedded generative systems. That is, systems that are really generating live. And here I'm going to jump directly to this example of a musical agent that is learning by listening to CDs and recordings of music. And it's doing style imitation directly on the audio domain. It's building a massive memory of sounds and a big machine learning, a big statistical model of how a given composer will sequence those sounds. And we've been using these systems live in Electronica in 2017. And the system was trained on a Turkish composer called Mehmet. And there is an example. the Mehmet is composing pretty cinematic style of music. More recently, we added machine listening to this musical agent, and now we play live with him on stage. We play this year at Mutech and in a number of other places with this agent in a project called Revive, where we get the agents to be trained on famous dead electroacoustic music composer, and we simply revive them on stage and we play with them. It's a pleasure, actually, to play with the system. The system is really good. Sometimes we actually stop playing because the system is just working very well. So we play in spaces like this dome in Montreal, where there's 250 speakers and a number of projectors, and people are lying down in the floor. We also generate visuals, because we find out that for people to really like experimental electronic music, it's way better to hook them and get the visual cortex activated a little. That way nobody is leaving the room ready. I won't play an example of this one for the sake of time. We've been using recently the same agent in an attractive touch-based interaction in Zurich called Zeta. So these are examples of online embedded generative systems that regenerate on the fly like that. We've been doing that as well for video game. Video game is really the paradigm of interactive systems nowadays, and it's online. And we've been doing video game level generation for a while. And in video game, what's important is to keep, and in interactive experience in general, is to keep the player in what we call the flow. That is, the game should not be so dull and empty so as to be boring, but it should not be too challenging so as to be discouraging. And to do that, generative systems are the best, because the flow varies from person to person. Some people will stagnate for a while, some people will move and require more stimulating experience really quickly. So if you want to drive good interaction, good interactive systems over the long term, generative system is the way, and the industry knows that. So we do generative video games, and of course, once we generate a level, when we generate a level, then it becomes sort of easy for us to have a generative music system that follows the player experience as the player goes through the game, and eventually the tension of the music, for example, will vary accordingly to the tension of the game. We actually have an empirical experiment coming out very soon, hopefully, if we get accepted, that shows that it makes a difference for the player indeed. We've also been doing other modalities. We've been looking at visual art. Before neural networks made this sort of inquiry a little bit obsolete, we were using other technique. We gave up on that. This is me in the style of Rembrandt, and this is me in the style of Horton. We've been using those type of visual generation system in some installation. We have an installation, a BCI-based installation called the Praise Station, in which you select a religion, and eventually the system is gonna generate imagery according to that religion. And so at the end of the day in the museum, you get images with there's an empty canvas that have been filled by all the beliefs of all the audience members that went through the museum during the day. And eventually we don't know if those beliefs are competing for the canvas or if they are sharing the canvas. Depends how you look at it, I guess. And other installation that I will pass through. We've been working on generative video because we do generative music. It made sense to do generative video clip, but I will pass on that for today. It's arguably a lot more difficult than generative music. It's a bit more complex. But I wanted to talk today because there were some talks today about generative movement and 3D animation and dance. We have a big movement database that we constituted of people moving, trying to express, actors and dancers trying to express different emotions. And using some deep learning technique, it means that we can now make style imitation of the way people move. And we can not only change the direction and vary the type of movement that they do in real time. This is also an online system, but we can eventually, in the latent space, interpolate between different performers. And here you have a subtle change in the hip between a male performer and a female performer. So you can have extremes in your latent space, in your data, and eventually go through those. We can also control the way this movement is going to be perceived. We make big empirical studies to do ground truthing of our data, and then it turns out people can perceive emotions without facial recognition, without face expression, just by movement. And here, for example, you get the character starting to look a little bit sad and despaired, and here it looks more confident and happy indeed. So if you show that to someone who does animation and who is running a motion capture studio, and there's a video game and they need 3,000 characters every 2 months because they have 11 million players that plays 20 hours per week on average, then they don't want to mock-up that many people. It is just not feasible. They don't want to do it by hand either. So those systems are going to be where it's going. We also looked at multimodal machine learning, where we train a system with both music and movement at the same time. That's the case of dance. And then this is a deep neural network dancing on generative music. It's not really dancing in the sense of contemporary dance yet. Some other people have been doing that quite successfully. This is just grooving. And of course we can make it look pretty, but I won't go through that. What's interesting in an artistic perspective, talking with choreographs, is not so much to have the neural network dance in a human, realistic way, but eventually to get the neural network not completely trained, or get the wrong type of neural network, and get the neural network to start dancing in weird ways. A bit of an intoxicated neural network, this one. And then eventually you can push things to extremes and have things that are really different. Why not? All right. We've been doing quite a bit of work on evaluation. Can someone tell me how long I have? Because I restarted the presentation, I'm a bit lost in time. Perfect, I'll take that then. Yeah, we've been looking at the evaluation of those generative systems, precisely because creative tasks are the tasks for which there's no optimal solution. The usual evaluation methods just don't work. The distance to optimal, it doesn't work the same way. And so there's many ways to evaluate the quality of an artifact that is the result of a creative task. Typically, the informal ways of doing so. If the music is good, the author is like, this is good, gets booked, eventually concerts, CDs. If the CDs are selling, then it means somewhat people like it. If people like it, it is good. Of course, as academics, we've been looking at more formal scientific ways to do that, and we've been developing a number of research instruments, both qualitative and quantitative. The latest paper, I think, we got an award for, was a new statistical test, actually, for style imitation with neural networks. But we've been looking at a vast number, I think there's 8 or 10 different instruments we've been developing in the last 10 years to try to look at evaluating those systems. Again, it's hard because there's no notion of optimality for creative tasks, but also because, by definition, those systems can generate ad infinitum. And then sometimes they'll be great, like you and I when we generate something or we interpret a piece of music or any practical creative task in the real world, and sometimes they won't be good. And so you need to decide which output you select and you run the evaluation on. Also, the systems have vast amounts of parameters, and some settings will work really well and some won't. So who decides that? How does it work? And eventually, if the machine learning systems, then those systems might work differently and with different level of quality depending on how they're trained and what they're trained on. So it makes the evaluation quite complicated. One classic way to do it is to do a sort of Turing test style approach, and here we can do the experiment together with harmonic progression, where we have 2 harmonic progression generated by the first system that are presented today, and we can do a little bit of a vote together. One is going to be human generated, and the other one is going to be machine generated, and I won't tell you which one is which. You'll have to do that work. There's definitely something wrong with playing sound. surprisingly. Try here. Okay, first. All right, second. All right, who thinks the first one is human? All right, about half. Oh, I gave you the answer. It didn't work. But if, okay. All right. Well. But the result would have been, hopefully, statistically speaking, that you would have failed at discriminating above chance level. And that's statistically significant result. And it doesn't matter if you're a musician and someone who knows composition really well or not. However, if you're someone who knows composition very well, you would have a great set of explanation for your answer. Your answer would not be, on average, more correct than people who don't know about music composition, but you would know why you would have answered what you answered, which is also important. Again, this is showing that this system is human competitive in some ways, but this is just short excerpt. It's interpreted by a machine, so there's no interpretation quality. It's obviously really easy to trump humans. So we have all sorts of other studies and instruments. This one is pretty old, that are a bit more refined than that. But it's still a pretty hard thing to do to evaluate those systems. We've also been looking at how people perceive those systems if we tell them that it's machine generated ahead of time versus if we don't tell them anything. Is there an explicit or an implicit bias against the system? At this moment, there are 3 studies that have been looking at that have been published, 1 by us and 2 by colleagues, and none of those studies agree. So I won't conclude. There's still a lot more work to be done. I suspect it will have to do with the computational literacy of the audience. People who know about programming computers would be a bit less biased than people who don't. It's an hypothesis. We would have to test that. All right, conclusion. I just sort of went through this argument of trying to show you a little bit of the work we've been doing in creative AI. And I want to finish by saying why it does matter, what I think it does matter. It does matter because it's fundamental research. It's scientific research on creative process. Can we model creativity? If we can, it's probably a complex system. Therefore, computer simulation is probably the best way to tackle whether a model is good or not. Typically, they're not. It's also important for artistic reason. It's a type of art. It's generative art. And computers being definitely the most common medium of the time, it makes sense that we appropriate it for cultural production. And that's important that artists get to criticize and get to debate around the various evolution of computer science. And finally, I think I showed that it has applications. And I looked at today 2 types of application, computer-assisted creativity, as well as embedded generative systems in interactive experiences. So those systems, especially the applied one, they start to get deployed. And there's every day new companies that are getting started that are using those systems. So of course, it starts to raise fears. And those fears are not new. When physical work was automated, there was riots and revolts about it. When music and music reproduction was mechanically possible, there was issues around it. But as a conclusion, technology has always continually shaped us from the invention of the wheel to the computerization of society, and away from fears of AI taking over. I'm personally a believer in the humanist tradition that I think Dr. Allen reminded us of in his opening speech regarding anthropomorphic instrumentalism, this idea that we, in fine, develop the tools we want and the tools that serve us, and we need to make sure that we agree on that and have a political debate on those situations if that is not the case. And so the computerization of society and the rise of autonomous machine is brutal and has deep implications, and the future is definitely generative, and AI is certainly part of it. But can we harness the power of machines not to replace humans, but to expand and support our creativity? That's the question I ask. So I want to thank my students in my lab. I have an online class too, actually, on a great platform that is teaching art to the masses. Only 7% of the world population has the privilege to go to university. 98% of the world population has access to the internet right now. So let's give them access to art. And for those who are really interested in those matters, we run a workshop on musical meta-creation. It's going to be the 7th time this year in conjunction with the International Conference on Computational Creativity. And we also run a workshop on movement computation for those who are interested in movement. So I want to thank my Canadian funding buddies, as well as thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone for your attention. And I see some people already have their hands up. So I think Daniel.
Hi, Daniel Howe, School of Creative Media. I have a question, I guess, for both of you that possibly highlights a point of maybe tension between the two presentations, which were both great. Thank you for both. I'm thinking about tools for artists and the tools that artists choose to use computationally. The first speaker talked about not using tools that you didn't understand, and in the second we're talking about more high-level tools that allow non-experts to create works quickly. So these tools are obviously useful in some way. They're more time efficient. But I wonder if such high-level tools teach us to accept the idea of black boxes that we don't look inside, and to accept the certain spaces of art that become easy to explore and frustrate other areas that are perhaps more difficult to explore because of the tools, and what this might teach us in terms of our relationship to power and authority, and I think this question of transparency or perhaps explainability is a key one, especially for machine learning, deep learning systems, which are notoriously opaque in their operation and their outcomes. So I wondered if both of you could maybe address or give us your thoughts on that.
Okay, so if I start, I'm happy about a tool where I don't know how it works, providing I know how to use it and know what results I can generate with it. That's fine. But I wasn't really talking about tools. I was talking about the media that we use. So for me, for example, software is a medium, not just a tool. And if I'm using a medium, if I'm using oil paint, I need to understand how to use oil paint very carefully, and I need to understand how it works in a very detailed way. If I'm using a hammer, I don't really need to know much about the construction of the hammer, so long as I know how to hold it. And if I do this with it, that I can hit something and get a nail in. So I distinguish between these two things, tools and media, very strongly. And I think that the remarks I made didn't apply to tools.
Yeah, I personally want to push back on the fact that there was a tension between implementation. First, I'm a big fan of what Ernest is doing, and I love the idea that he's doing, as he was describing, system you interact with, and at some stage you can be surprised by what's happening, because even though it's deterministic, it's a complex system, and through time the influence become maybe lost, and he himself was surprised by some of the behavior of his own artwork. So sometimes you know how it works, and it still bring that level of interaction where there's complexity. And that, I think, is really what we're looking at here as well. We're not looking at low-level interaction where you do ping, you have your hand, it does ping, and you move your arm, it does ping, the mirroring thing that we see so much. We're looking at systems where you interact with some of my musical agents, you have no idea what they're going to do. You really don't. And you really have to interact like a dialogue. So the real definition of interaction is when there's a structure that emerges from the entire action, that is the action of two agents being present like in a dialogue. The second point I want to quickly make is the fact that those tools don't have to be black boxes. And the first harmonic progression generator is a Markov chain sort of system. It's extremely simple to explain. And that's why we put classes online to explain people. And that's why we think through art we can get even more people to understand those tools that they will get to interact with on a daily basis from now on, whether it's for making art or for all sorts of other purposes and reasons. So there's really obviously an interest in being pedagogical about those tools. Some of them are harder to explain than others. I'm still not sure I understand how a microwave works, but that's how it is.
Can I quick respond? I'm not sure the distinction between tools and media is so clear, or at least not for me. Is a programming language a tool? Is a programming language a library a tool? Or are those media? And then just to the second point, can you extend that to many of the systems we've been talking about in this conference, which are sort of more traditional deep neural net systems that are, as I said, notoriously difficult to understand how they're learning what they're learning, or why they output what they output.
Let's answer the first part, but for the second part, it is now in Europe, as was said in one of the presentations, a law that if a system, deep learning or not, make an important decision about your life, you can, for example, CVs are typically not read by humans anymore, but by machines. So they decide which is going to get eventually read by a human and get a job or not, and things like that. It is a law in Europe now, or in preparation at least, that the AI in front of a judge will have to explain itself, or someone will have to explain that decision. The judge will have the possibility to ask the same type of question he would to a human. And so, again, politics and the democratic politic debate is there to make sure that we don't deploy those systems in a way that is nefast to society, right?
So if I can maybe try to explain a little bit more of this thinking. With a tool, you can always substitute one tool for another. Okay, so instead of a hammer, I could use a big spanner, for example. The hammer might be better, but the big spanner might do the job just as well if I handle it, right? But with the medium is actually central to the work that one is making. I can't paint the same painting in oil paint that I can paint in watercolor. The watercolor paint is a central part of that artwork. So in terms of your example of programming languages, for example, I could write in C or Python the same thing. So you could argue that the language is a tool, and that's fine. But the notion of the algorithm itself is the medium that I'm using, and that I can make work using algorithms that I cannot make in other ways. Okay. But it can be that I might implement that algorithm using different tools, and there are thousands of different software tools that essentially do the same thing, but it might just be that one of them is easier to use than another, so I prefer to use this one rather than that one. But the algorithm is at the center of it. So I always say that the computer isn't really important to us, it's the computation, it's the whole notion of computation that's important and that is central to what we're doing, not the computer as an object.
And since I had the time to think about it while Ernest was answering, I will add something to my first answer, which is the fact that, for example, in the US, there's about 6 million people who make a living out of driving a vehicle. We now have the technology, whether they understand how it works or not, we have the technology to displace those jobs if we want to. That's a political debate, right? I don't think it's a good idea. Those people are not going to learn how to program deep learning networks tomorrow. They might not understand them. but we need to have that debate. This is really where science, the nuclear is a good example. Science is about providing knowledge, and the usage of knowledge is in the end of society.
Yes, back there.
Hello, thanks for both talks. This is a question for Ernest Edmonds. In a paper written in 1973, together with Stroud Cornack, you argued to abolish the notion of the artwork, if I interpret that correctly, in favor of something that's called the matrix in the context of computer-generated art or machine-generated art. Would you comment on if that is still actual, and do we need a special notion for artworks in the context of machines, or can we welcome them to the classical terms of the art system, like artwork and artists?
Well, first of all, if we said we would have wanted to abolish the artwork, it was in the sense that Pierre Boulez said abolish the opera houses. It was to make a point. But the matrix notion, the art system notion, was promoting the idea of the total systems view of the artwork to include the participant, to include the audience in the artwork. It's taking the step further. So, Duchamp said, until someone comes to look at an artwork, it doesn't exist, or worse to that effect. But this is taking it further and saying that if the artwork is dynamic and in some way interacts or is influenced by the audience, then the work that is of interest is the system that includes that audience and that participant. And I think that is still very much the case today. And I listen to each talk I listen to hear how much people are thinking about that total system, or whether they are still thinking about this little object, this neural network or something, and ignoring its relationship with the audience, because actually I think it's dangerous to ignore that relationship. So I stick by what we said all those years ago.
I think there are some questions over here. One and then...
Thank you for your talks. Very interesting both. I've got a question for Philippe. I'm not, for example, when you show when went wrong with the audio, and you're trying to do the Turing test with us. So the question, I'm not sure, I hope I'll put it right, but Turing tests have been widely discredited in terms of being able to say anything about the intelligence of the system. And so I'm not really sure why we kind of had that experiment, but the actual question is, like, given that there is a little bit of consensus of what creativity might mean, so a lot of people refer to Boden and so forth, but there's not a wide enough consensus to characterize what really creativity might involve, so to have agreement at a general level. And similarly, in this area, there's a few methods have been proposed, whether it's face or the tripod or specs or what have you. But there is still no agreement as to if there's a standardized evaluation method for creative systems. So what is your opinion on that, and where you think this is going, and how can this be addressed?
Yes, first I agree that this is quite a dumb experiment and quite a primitive one. But if you talk to the people at Electronic Arts and they want to embed generative system in their game, they're not going to ask the composer if this is good music that the system makes. They want to know if the audience can make the difference or not. And if we generate live, and on top of that it follows the game a little bit closer, and they can generate much more content and take the user's preference into account at generation time, then they're going to be interested in it, but they still want to know if the audience can tell or not. so that's why those tests still have some value, but not. And the second thing I want to say is those systems themselves are very dumb and primitive, as we will find out soon. No very good musicians would make a great career out of doing pastiche. Those systems are just doing pastiche, right? Now, they can be funny pastiche. You can be like, oh, I want the rhythm of Bob Marley with the harmonics of Metallica. Maybe it's going to sound terrible, probably. Maybe it's going to be great, and I can explore that, and it's going to take me 3 minutes, and not like half a day trying to compose by hand. So that's what the values of the system is, but that's just one very small types of creativity, style imitation that I talked about. And as far as I know, anyone that I know that I consider creative in the sense of making good art, I never saw a machine do any of that. And I'm pretty glad about that.
Thank you so much for this, these great presentations. I have so many questions, but I think I have one that I would like to ask more than the others, which is I'd like to hear you say, maybe even advance, maybe speculatively, how you think computational creativity and creative AI are going to impact the art world in the future, specifically things like the conditions of the artist, social economic conditions, but also how it might redefine the art world.
Okay, so
Big question, sorry.
I said I'll have a go because I thought if I start talking, maybe I'll think of an answer to this difficult question as I start talking. Well, I think there are a number of things. First of all, to get rid of, if you like, a simple point, which is that artificial intelligence can be used very effectively and is being used very effectively for sort of like transducers, so like image analysis, sound analysis, generation of things. So just to deal with how the artwork acts within the system and interacts with others, then, if you like, pattern analysis type of use of artificial intelligence is quite straightforward. But that wasn't, I think, the point of your question. You were looking at a deeper use of artificial intelligence in terms of managing or operating the art system as a whole. I think that where it's a challenge to the artist, let's look at it from that point of view, is this, that what we've seen as we've moved from art that used to just use mathematics and geometry, for example, perspective and so on and so forth, to artwork that uses software, we've enabled the artist to think at a higher and higher level about the work that they're doing. Okay? And lower level things get done kind of more speedily or more automatically. So the artist is being able to think at this higher level. And I don't know whether it's going to be the case really, because I think we're in a confused state at this moment, which is why this conference is very important to us, is that maybe that the artificial intelligence used at the center of the system will enable us to think at a higher level still. So that in generative art, we tend to think about the principles that underlie how the work should be, which are kind of like the principles of perspective. There's not really much different to that, except that instead of drawing the stuff out ourselves, the computer program does it. Plus, it can do it infinitely, so we can have infinitely changing artworks based on these principles. If we have artificial intelligence, if you like, above these generative rules, then we will be expressing some principles at a higher level where we don't know or cannot understand how those principles will get operated upon. With traditional generative art, we know how the rules get operated upon. Okay. So the question, the challenge for the artist is whether they can still make art that is meaningful in a human sense and valuable to themselves and to others by taking this the next step. And I think that's the interesting challenge. And we've heard comments about this around the room. And I think that those people who are brave enough to use neural nets, for example, are looking at the hardest problem here. That's the hardest way to do it. maybe that's the best way to tackle it, because then we really come across the most difficult problems and maybe we'll help to solve them. I don't actually think that they will change the art world any more than the art world is changing for other reasons. But what the artist does is the place where I see the challenge.
Yeah, I concur, and I would add two things. With the type of system I was showing, computer-assisted creativity type of system, for example, computer-assisted composition, it does at least two things. One of them is that it's going to allow a lot more people to become, in a way, composer and to compose. Ableton has 6 million users, and they find they sell a lot of software, so is Native, and a bunch of other companies, and they find people buy the gears, and then they never finish a track, ever. And they love making the sounds and everything, they just can't put together rhythm, harmonic progressions, melodies, hooks and stuff. That's just the way it is. And with those type of tools, they can. And maybe they can add a way and make art that is actually really interesting. The second thing is for professionals, artists. Art means a lot of things. There's contemporary art and high art, but there's also a lot of people, most of the artists are creatives in companies, and they get phone calls on Monday saying, hey, BBC is here, we're going to sell that documentary in 23 countries, can you make a pastiche of that song? There's no way we pay copyright for that guy in all those countries. And that's already happening. And it's a human doing it, and the guy is going to spend a week making a pastiche. With that machine, he'll just spend a day doing so. Personally, my initial motivation is that I'm a poor composer, and then also I'm lazy. I hate spending time in front of computers clicking on buttons. I want things to get done and be doing the interesting part of the work. And I think that's the idea behind the development of those tools. When the gardeners, when how do you call the machine to cut the grass? Lawnmower. When the lawnmower was invited, the gardeners were unhappy, and then they realized that actually not spending all day cutting the grass with scissors was actually a good thing, and it ended up allowing for better gardening. When the waving machine were invented, people were really pissed, but then later on, haute couture was invented because a lot of very skilled people would end up doing something else. And so I concur with what Ernest said, it's about elevating the level and the type of work that we can do. It doesn't mean that nobody is gonna necessarily be displaced because of that. That is again more of a political question, and I call everyone to be more politically engaged. That certainly is a good thing to do.
Could I maybe add something to that, which is that a challenge for us, most of us in this room probably, or many of us, is in relation to evaluation, so that a lot of us are evaluating whether the AI's creative stuff produces things that are interesting. But there's a more important evaluation question to address, which is the composers, the painters, the artists of one kind or another who are using these artificial intelligence. How do they use it? How do they feel about it? What are the mechanisms that they find valuable, and what mechanisms do they not find valuable? How do these artificial intelligence systems help them make better work? This is an interesting question that is important for this future.
Over here, Triton Mobley from USC. That response seems contradictory to the original statement that was made earlier, in that the idea that somehow these technologies and the advancements of these technologies will sort of further push the artists to higher levels. However, that seems contradictory or counter to the argument that you were making, that for yourself, of not needing to know how the systems work and only needing to understand the output. And then the same to you, Philippe, in terms of this idea of, we'll just use black box for lack of a better word, this idea and the fact that if these systems are sort of developed in such a way where the artist understands their usage to a greater extent, but not necessarily being provided the back-end knowledge of from the ground up, right? Like the systems or the tools that you're providing online are still sort of being top-down delivered, and they don't seem to be sort of like developed in concert with those who need access to these tools. And so it seems if there is this tension, and perhaps the diagram that you showed of where flow for video game, of where it almost seems as if like the argument is being made that the creative pursuits and the intellectual pursuit of the artist is to be maintained within some system of flow of where if it's too lowbrow, they may be disinterested, and if it's too technical, they may lose interest, and so therefore we are maintaining a system of where it's just enough of knowing the output and also equally enough of understanding how the tool operates to function within a creative process. And so if both of you could sort of speak to that, because it really, like, again, I do see tension. I know that you said that there wasn't any, but that those two things seem counter to the arguments that you made earlier in your response to Dan Howe's comment.
Yeah, I understand why they could appear like it's tension, but in fact it's just because it's a little bit complicated. But in my mind, at least, there's no tension there. The flow thing I was talking about is just for the interactor, and so that doesn't have to do with art making per se. But for the other point on the opacity of the tool, there's room for everyone. And yesterday, the speakers in the panel on machine learning, Jean and all the others, were showing the other way of doing it, which is DIY. You know, the Leonardo model, where now we're at a stage where artists, and there's tools for artists to appropriate those tools and go from the ground up and build them. Now again, it's not anyone and everyone who is going to do that, and that's fine. You know, there's people who are going to build their microwave themselves, and there's going to be people who are going to have to buy a microwave that is already made and not know how it works really. And I don't think, you know, there's a contradiction neither a tension there. Again, there's space for everyone and every practice. Likewise, those practices are not going to replace other existing practice in which those black box problem existed already. You know, if a violinist would know how to make a Stradivarius, well, they would stop being a violinist. They would start making Stradivarius because these guys were worth a lot of money.
So to take the 2 points as I understand them, first of all, understanding the medium. First of all, I was distinguishing between the medium and the tool. To me, software is a medium. And that means I need to understand it in detail if I'm going to use it, right? It's very important to understand. So I believe that for my work, it's important to understand how a device driver works, and if I need to write one, if it comes down to it, because crucial decisions are made at that level, right? And so the understanding the software is central to understanding the medium. That's what it is, and that's crucial to this work. And if I might throw in an advert, sometime next year an MIT press book will come out, authored by myself and Margaret Bowden, about computational art of one form or another, and including interviews with quite a few artists who write code, and the whole tone of the book is about to understand software as a medium and what it means to work with it in making art. So the first point is that was a misunderstanding of my expression. Okay. The second point, which is to do with the diagram that Philippe put up about the you know, laying in this sweet spot, if you like, in this area. I think that this is a very important idea, but I don't quite agree with the way you characterized it. I put it like this, that what it seems to me is that in some interactive system, especially a traditional interactive system, not the influence ones that I'm talking about, people often look to try to understand how it works. You know, if I do this, will it do that, kind of thing. And what we find, and we've done studies on this also in my groups, what we find is that if it's too easy to understand, once they get it, that's it. It's lost. Interest is lost. Right. If, on the other hand, it all appears to be random and there's no even sense of being able to understand it, then it's equally uninteresting to people. So the need is to find this sweet spot or the sweet line in the middle where it kind of seems like you can almost grasp it, but not quite. And that might come about through the particular level of complexity of the system, or it might come about because the system is actually changing over time and always just slightly ahead of you or something. But this notion of something between engendering in the audience a feeling that you've kind of got it, but also you can't quite get it, is something that seems to be quite an important element in the aesthetic experience.
Maybe Daniel first and then Jason.
I just wanted to push a little on that idea of software as medium that one must understand to use, because if you extend that to its sort of logical conclusion, there's so many levels that go into a software, from the silicon to the operating system interrupts to the drivers, like you mentioned, to the the low-level libraries, the high-level libraries, all the way up. I would challenge anyone to say that they understand every element of that stack.
So now you're contradicting yourself. You were like complaining about the black box thing, and now you admit that the black boxes are everywhere, whether we want it or not, right?
I'm not. I think that there is that acknowledging that complexity when you use software is important, and to think carefully, especially from a pedagogical perspective, as to what you give access to the user and also to the audience. And then to that last comment, I'm not sure when you look at games as interactive experiences, right? We see a game like Tetris, where how it works and the rules of it are immediately apparent, and yet people play it for many, many hours at a time, and there are many countless examples of this. The space that your graph reminded me was Chris Langton's, I think it was called the lambda parameter for generative art, in which you have sort of total randomness on one side, total predictability on the other side, and then this sort of sweet spot of surprise, or however you want to characterize it, non-random, non-totally random surprise or interest. I don't know.
Okay,
Finished. We have one more question.
Just a quick response, which is that the reason I was stressing algorithm rather than anything else was that for the most part the algorithm is the core. Okay, however it's implemented. The point about the levels that you go to depends on what you're interested in. So if, for example, timing is very critical, then it might be that the algorithm that's in the device driver matters. But if timing isn't an issue, for example, you're producing a computer-generated drawing, then it's of no consequence at that level. So it does depend what you're doing, which algorithm matters, but it's the algorithm level that...
Sorry, Jason, I think time is up. We need to go down and have coffee. I apologize. Maybe you can ask your question informally. So please express your...